Welcome back, everybody. It's time for another deep dive. Today, we're heading over to Rojava, northeastern Syria. You might remember Rojava from the news about the fight against ISIS. We've got this article here. It's titled, The Legacy of ISIS and the Struggle in Rojava at the Crossroads of Terrorism and Politics.
And, wow, does that title ever hit the nail on the head?
Yeah.
Because even though ISIS was militarily defeated, Rojava is still dealing with the consequences.
It's like, it's almost like, when you have an earthquake, the tremors subside, but you still have those aftershocks. That's kind of what it's like. So we're gonna kind of explore what those aftershocks are. What they look like and why they still matter years later.
Yeah. What's so striking about this situation is that, defeating ISIS on the battlefield, it didn't just automatically extinguish the ideology, what fueled it. And the article raises a very sobering point. That ISIS ideology, it's still a powerful force, even though their so-called caliphate has crumbled. And one of the most disturbing examples of this is Al-Hol camp, sprawling, overcrowded camp, housing families of suspected ISIS fighters.
Yeah, that phrase, cubs of the caliphate, really stuck with me. The article uses it to describe the children growing up in Al-Hol. It's a pretty bleak picture, isn't it? Thousands of children raised in an environment just saturated with the remnants of ISIS ideology.
It's a chilling thought. It really is.
Yeah.
And it really does raise some serious concerns about the potential for radicalization. I mean, imagine a generation of kids growing up in Al-Hol with very limited access to education, healthcare, opportunities.
Right.
And they're surrounded by individuals who still cling to the extremist beliefs of ISIS.
Yeah.
It's just a recipe for disaster and a very stark reminder. That just because you have these military victories doesn't mean you have lasting peace.
Right. And speaking of kind of lingering threats, the article also talks about the challenge of managing the estimated 12,000 ISIS prisoners held in Kurdish-run prisons across Rojava. And these aren't, your typical state-of-the-art facilities. A lot of them are makeshift prisons set up in former schools or other repurposed buildings.
Right. And the conditions in these prisons are often described as just dire, overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, limited access to medical care. The article even makes comparisons to Guantanamo Bay, which is a pretty damning indictment.
Yeah.
So the Kurdish forces were so instrumental in defeating ISIS on the ground.
Yeah.
They're now left dealing with this massive prison population with very limited resources and international support.
That's a huge burden to bear for a region that's already trying to rebuild after years of conflict.
Right.
And it brings up another key point. The lack of international responsibility. A lot of these prisoners, they're foreign fighters from countries across the globe, but their home country, particularly in Europe, have been very reluctant to repatriate them.
Yeah. And this reluctance stems from a very complex web of factors. You've got security concerns, legal complexities, public opinion. Some governments worry that repatriated fighters, they could pose a security threat, while others are grappling with the legal challenges of prosecuting people for crimes committed abroad. And then, of course, there's the issue of public perception. A lot of citizens they're unwilling to welcome back people who joined a terrorist organization.
Right. So the Kurdish forces are stuck. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, they're responsible for the security and well-being of thousands of ISIS prisoners, many of whom aren't even their own citizens.
Yeah.
That's a situation that seems like it could go wrong very easily.
It is. It really is a powder keg waiting to explode. The overcrowded conditions in these prisons, they just create a breeding ground for radicalization.
Right.
Where you have hardened ISIS veterans able to indoctrinate new recruits. And the lack of international support really just exacerbates the problem. The Kurdish forces are stretched thin, trying to manage this very volatile situation with very limited resources and manpower. So,
it's a recipe for potential prison breaks, unrest, and even further instability.
Yeah. And then on top of that, Rojava finds itself in this precarious geopolitical situation.
Right.
The region declared autonomy during the Syrian civil war, but they don't have official recognition from Syria or any other country for that matter. So they're essentially in limbo, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. It's like this island of self-governance. In this sea of instability and this lack of recognition leaves them vulnerable to external pressures, particularly from their neighbor, Turkey.
Yeah. And Turkey views the Kurdish militias in Rojava, known as Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, with a lot of suspicion. Understand why. We need to take a look at the history of the region.
Okay. The main issue really lies in Turkey's conflict with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK.
Mhm.
The PKK is a Kurdish separatist organization that has been waging an armed struggle against the Turkish state for decades. Turkey considers the PKK a terrorist organization, and they view the SDF as an extension of the PKK.
Right, so a strong, autonomous Kurdish force on their border,
No.
that's a big security concern for Turkey.
Exactly.
They're worried it could embolden the PKK and fuel separatist sentiments
Exactly.
among their own Kurdish population.
Right. Turkey has actually launched military incursions into Rojava, saying it's to combat terrorism and secure their border.
Mm-hmm.
But these incursions have only further destabilized the region and made the situation more precarious for the Kurds. And you also have to remember, this conflict is deeply rooted in historical grievances and a struggle for self-determination. The Kurds have faced decades of oppression and marginalization,
Right.
so their aspirations for autonomy are met with resistance from regional powers like Turkey.
So you have this complex interplay of factors. You've got the legacy of ISIS, the challenges of managing the prison population, the lack of international support, and the geopolitical tensions with Turkey. It kind of paints a bleak picture for Rojava's future, doesn't it?
It's definitely a challenging situation. And the article highlights,
Yeah.
how fragile this experiment in self-governance is. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the resilience and determination of the Kurdish people. They've faced incredible hardships,
Right.
but they're still striving for a better future. They're building a society based on principles of democratic confederalism, gender equality,
Yeah.
and ecological sustainability.
That's definitely a glimmer of hope
Yeah.
in this otherwise pretty grim landscape. It really makes you wonder, what responsibility does the international community have in supporting these aspirations and helping to deal with the long-term consequences of the fight against ISIS?
That's a crucial question,
Yeah.
and it's one we'll definitely explore further in the next part of our deep dive. So stay tuned as we look into the role of the international community, the challenges of repatriation, and the search for justice and accountability in the wake of ISIS's reign of terror.
So we've been talking about this incredibly complex situation in Rojava and the weight of responsibility that's really been placed on the Kurdish forces. And it seems like the international community has largely just turned a blind eye to their plight. The article actually uses the term international abandonment, which really kind of resonates with the sense of betrayal the Kurds must feel.
Yeah, it is a powerful term, and it really encapsulates that feeling of frustration and disappointment from those who, really bore the brunt of the fight against ISIS and then were left to grapple with the aftermath, largely on their own. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine putting your life on the line to fight this global threat and then just be abandoned by those who you thought should be helping you rebuild and ensure a lasting peace.
Right. It's not just a moral failing either. It's also strategically short-sighted. We've talked about the ticking time bomb that is the overcrowded prisons
Yeah.
and the potential for Al-Hol camp to become a breeding ground for a new generation of extremists. If those threats aren't addressed,
Right.
they could very easily spill over and destabilize the entire region with global repercussions.
Absolutely. Terrorism knows no borders. And ignoring the root causes, like you said, the conditions that allow extremism to flourish, that's just going to exacerbate the problem in the long run.
Right.
And actually, the Kurdish forces are calling for an international tribunal to hold ISIS fighters accountable for their crimes. They argue that this isn't just a regional issue, which, they're right. The crimes committed by ISIS affected people all over the world.
So they're saying the world came together to fight ISIS militarily, but now we need that same unified effort
Right.
to address the legal and humanitarian challenges that still remain.
Exactly. Justice and accountability. Those are essential parts of preventing future extremism. If ISIS fighters are allowed to just, languish in these overcrowded prisons without facing any real consequences, it just sends such a dangerous message.
Right.
Not only does it undermine the rule of law, but it also risks emboldening other extremist groups and individuals who might see that as a sign that there's no real price to pay for their actions.
Yeah. Beyond the security and the legal implications, there's also the humanitarian crisis in Al-Hol.
Right.
Thousands of women and children are living there in deplorable conditions,
Yes.
and a lot of them are victims of ISIS themselves. Their needs are massive: food, shelter, healthcare, education, psychological support, and the Kurdish authorities just don't have the resources to provide adequate help.
Exactly. And this is another area where the international community has a moral obligation to help, to share the burden. Humanitarian aid is important, of course, but it's not enough. We need to think about long-term solutions that address the root causes of extremism.
Right.
and give these people real opportunities to rebuild their lives.
You mentioned earlier that the Kurds are striving for autonomy, for a system of self-governance. What does that actually look like in practice?
Oh. Rojava has implemented what they call democratic confederalism,
Okay.
which emphasizes grassroots democracy, gender equality, and ecological sustainability.
Wow.
They have their own constitution,
Yeah.
their own institutions, and their own armed forces, the SDF. They even created their own school curriculum that focuses on pluralism, critical thinking, and peaceful conflict resolution. It's really a radical experiment in self-governance, especially considering it's taking place in such a chaotic and violent environment.
So they're basically trying to build a new society from scratch. In the middle of a war zone, it's inspiring, but it also makes their situation seem even more precarious. They're facing threats from all sides, ISIS remnants, Turkish incursions, the Syrian regime, and they lack international recognition.
It's a constant uphill battle. And their future, it's very uncertain. But the article also points out their resilience and determination. Despite these overwhelming challenges, they're still striving for a more just and equitable society.
It really makes you think about the nature of conflict and intervention and responsibility. I mean, if the international community is willing to intervene militarily to defeat a threat like ISIS, don't we have an obligation to address the long-term consequences?
A really important question.
Yeah.
And one that we all need to consider.
Yeah.
The fight against terrorism. It doesn't end with just bombs and bullets.
Right.
It requires a sustained commitment to addressing the underlying conditions that allow extremism to take root in the first place.
Yeah.
And a willingness to support those who are working to build a more peaceful and just future.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the complexities in Rojava, the challenges for the Kurdish forces, and the need for greater international engagement. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into potential solutions, the challenges of repatriation, and the ongoing struggle to create a lasting peace in the shadow of ISIS. So stay tuned. We've spent this deep dive really digging into the ongoing struggles Rojava is facing after ISIS. And you know it's clear that a military victory, it doesn't automatically mean you've got peace. There are just so many layers here. Political, humanitarian, ideological, and it feels...
The international community is having trouble wrapping their heads around just how complex it all is.
Yeah, there's this tendency to declare victory and just move on. And that's dangerous, especially with a group like ISIS. You need long-term commitment, a multifaceted approach. We need to go beyond just containing the threat and really start looking at what's causing these ideologies to spread. Right. And we've been talking about these ticking time bombs, you know, the prisons, Al-Hol camp. What can the international community actually do to reduce these risks, to try to prevent things from getting even more unstable?
Well, I think the first thing is just admitting that this is a shared responsibility. The Kurdish forces did most of the fighting against ISIS, but they shouldn't be the only ones dealing with the aftermath.
Right.
We need a coordinated international effort to provide humanitarian aid, to support rehabilitation and reintegration of former ISIS members, and to work towards a real lasting solution for all the displaced people stuck in these camps like Al-Hol.
That makes sense, but the whole repatriation issue seems really tough. A lot of countries don't want to take back their citizens who join ISIS. They say they're worried about security.
Right.
They say it's hard to prosecute crimes that happened in another country.
Yeah.
How do we balance those concerns with doing the right thing, taking responsibility for our own citizens?
It is tricky, but ignoring the problem won't solve anything.
Right.
We need strategies that address the security concerns, but also the humanitarian side of things.
Okay.
So that might mean specialized rehabilitation programs,
Right.
psychological support, working closely with local communities to help with reintegration. And most importantly, we need countries to work together and share the responsibility. No one country can fix this alone.
We also discussed the Kurdish call for an international tribunal to hold ISIS fighters accountable.
Yeah.
Do you think that could actually happen? And what impact could it have, you know, in terms of preventing future atrocities?
Setting up an international tribunal would be very complicated, politically charged, but I think it's necessary for justice, for the victims of ISIS, and to send a clear message that these crimes won't go unpunished if it's done well. A tribunal could also discourage people from joining terrorist groups, from committing these acts, because they'll know there are consequences.
Right.
And it can help us understand ISIS better. You know, their network, their funding, how they recruit.
That makes sense.
That kind of information would be very valuable for future counterterrorism efforts.
So it's obvious that dealing with the legacy of ISIS requires more than military solutions. We need diplomacy, development, humanitarian aid, and we need to listen to the people who are most affected, like the Kurds, who have been on the front lines of this whole fight.
Absolutely. Their experience, what they've learned,
They
that's
do.
all essential as we try to figure out how to rebuild and how to reconcile
Yeah.
the Kurdish people. They've shown such incredible resilience and determination in the face of just awful adversity.
It's true.
They've created a functioning system of self-governance,
Yeah.
even if it is fragile.
Yeah.
And they're committed to democratic values, to gender equality, to peaceful coexistence. It's a real sign of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure and can keep striving for a better future.
Yeah. We started by asking about the lasting impact of ISIS on Rojava, and it's definitely clear that the fight is far from over. But there is this sense of hope, this belief that a brighter future is possible.
The road ahead is going to be long, and it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
But if we work together, if we acknowledge this shared responsibility, and if we learn from those who have been most affected, then we can create a world where these kinds of horrors are less likely to happen.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through this topic. It's been incredibly insightful. And to all our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this thought. What role can each of us play in supporting the pursuit of justice and peace and understanding in a world that's still dealing with the legacy of extremism